I'm going to just make a short talk, and hopefully we can have some time for questions and discussion. I want to begin by thanking one person, in particular Jim Lessar. I think the fact that we're here today is a testimony to our respect for Jim, the work that he's done over the past several decades. I had the privilege of working with Jim on what became the Jfk Records Act of 1992, which resulted in the declassification of many of the government's files on this subject. At the time, I was a legislative assistant to Representative Lee Hamilton in the U.S. House of Representatives. Our original bill would have just declassified the files of the House Select Committee, which could have been done by a simple vote of the House. However, this had been blocked in the Congress for over a decade. After the release of Oliver Stone's film JFK, a tremendous wave of public support made it possible for us to expand the scope of the bill to include all government agencies and to pass the bill through both houses of Congress and have it signed by President Bush shortly before the 1992 election. I'd like to say that Lee Hamilton deserves a great amount of credit for his work both publicly and behind the scenes in the Congress, which enabled this bill to be passed. I would also like to say that Oliver Stone deserves great credit for his courage in making JFK the film and putting this subject on the national agenda. And John Newman also deserves credit for that bill. And he actually, I just want to show this. He just gave me this. Where is it? I had forgotten about. This is a Free the Files button, which was part of our campaign in the Congress, which ultimately resulted in that legislation. And I believe about 2 or 3 million pages of documents have been released under that bill. So thank you to John, among others. I later went to work with Oliver Stone and helped produce the film NIXON, among other things. But I'd also like to say a word about another person that I worked for in the Senate, and that's John Kerry, now the Secretary of State. As you may know, John Kerry made a statement last year in a televised interview with Tom Brokaw for the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. He said he did not believe that Oswald acted alone, that he had too many suspicious connections, and that there had to have been others involved in the assassination. To my knowledge, John Kerry is the most senior government official, and certainly the only one in this administration, to have the courage to say publicly that there had to have been a plot. And I'd also like to just say a word about one other person who's here. That's my father, Dr. David Hamburg. I appreciate his support. As president of the Institute of Medicine in Washington and later as head of the Carnegie Foundation in New York, he worked closely with Senator Ted Kennedy on healthcare legislation and on arms control initiatives with Ted Sorensen, McGeorge Bundy, and Robert McNamara to help carry on the legacy of President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. So I want to give him the credit he deserves for those efforts. And I think we all share in a sense of admiration for President Kennedy, not only for what he did in his short time in office, but what he might have done. If President Kennedy had lived, I believe he would have ended the Cold War decades before it finally came to a close. The Vietnam War would not have been fought, as John Newman has documented, and thousands of lives would have been saved. America would have been a different place, but that is what might have been. So my real interest in this case started probably around the time of the 25th anniversary in 1988. Shortly after that, I began to work for Lee Hamilton and got in touch with Jim Lessar. I began to feel that what was needed was not more theories, but more facts. It was this feeling that led to my work with Jim on the JFK bill and to some personal investigations into certain aspects of the assassination over the next few years. In 1994 and 1995, I had the good fortune of meeting at different times with two very interesting characters in this saga who were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, Fabian Escalante and E. Howard Hunt. They never met each other, but I was able to spend time with both over the next decade or so and got to know them both. I felt that each in his own way had valuable information to contribute to this subject. First, I want to talk a little bit about Fabian Escalante and his investigation. I had the opportunity to go to Cuba in 1994 and spend 2 weeks there in discussions with Escalante, his colleague Arturo Rodriguez, Brazilian author Claudia Furiati, and others. Part of the discussion was about a possible film about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a great deal of time was devoted to discussing his investigation into the JFK assassination on behalf of the Cuban government. I had additional opportunities to meet with Escalante at a conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1995 and at conferences in Havana in 2001 and 2002. Escalante is a former chief of Cuban counterintelligence with the rank of general in charge of preventing plots against Fidel Castro and attacks on Cuba since the early 1960s. Obviously, he has a bias and a point of view given his position in Cuba. However, he's also a very experienced intelligence professional with deep knowledge of Cuban exile groups and the CIA mafia plots against Castro and Cuba. Escalante had collaborated with Claudia Furiati on a book called ZR Rifle, The Plot to Kill Kennedy and Castro, which was published in 1994. The preface to the book contains this quote from Escalante. Quote, "The bringing to light of the truth about this atrocious murder is the responsibility of the U.S. authorities. Our endeavors concerning this case have been mainly directed at making it clear to U.S. and world public opinion that we had nothing to do with this horrible crime. We believe that the allegations of our government's involvement in the assassination were aimed at justifying a military invasion to overthrow the Cuban Revolution." This summarizes the thesis of Claudia Furiati's book and of Escalante's investigation. Her book is based on a series of interviews with Escalante and material from Cuban classified files, which was made available for the first time for the book. Escalante later wrote his own book on the subject called JFK, The Cuba Files, The Untold Story of the Plot to Kill Kennedy, which was published in 2006. By the way, I think it's interesting that Escalante's version is very close to what we heard yesterday from Antonio Veciana. So they basically agree. In fact, Veciana told me that Escalante had asked to meet with him in Mexico, but that never happened. Anyway, in his book, Escalante provides his information and analysis of the events leading up to Kennedy's assassination, names the people he considers to be the prime suspects in the case. He includes extensive background information on these individuals. By the way, I just want to show you the two books. I think if anybody is interested, this is Claudia's book, and where's this? This is Escalante's book, and so if you're interested, you can order them. By the way, I've brought copies of my own book on this subject, and also a book by St. John Hunt about his father, Howard Hunt, and these are free and available to anybody who wants to take one, so with my compliments. I'm just going to quickly list some of the top suspects that Escalante named, and if we have more time, we can get into some of these later. Eladio del Valle, Herminio Diaz Garcia, these are all Cubans. Antonio Veciana, Manuelito Rodriguez, a.k.a. Manuel Escobar, Fermín de Goycochea Sanchez, Isidro Borja, Manuel Salvat, Carlos Bringuer, Victor Hernandez Espinosa, and Sergio Arcacha Smith. Escalante also named David Phillips, E. Howard Hunt, David Morales, Richard Helms, and Santos Traficante as prime suspects as well. And he believed that Richard Helms was in charge of the conspiracy, that he was the top person. And then, just by way of contrast, I'll just name 8 people that were named by E. Howard Hunt late in his life as his suspects in the plot, some of which I don't agree with. Lyndon Johnson, Cord Meyer, David Phillips, William Harvey, Antonio Veciana, Frank Sturgis, David Morales, and Lucien Sarti. By the way, I don't share his view on Veciana. I don't believe that he was part of a conspiracy as far as I know. And I think it's interesting. Let me just say, I'll say one thing which Escalante emphasized to me and also in his book. Mr. Veciana has courageously stated that he did meet with David Phillips in Dallas in the presence of Lee Harvey Oswald. Escalante said that as an experienced intelligence professional, he did not believe that David Phillips would bring 2 of his agents at the same place at the same time unless he wanted them to meet and had a reason for doing so. He believed that the reason might have been that Phillips would want Oswald, who was about to travel to Mexico City, to get in touch with a relative of Veciana's named Guillermo Ruiz, a Cuban diplomat in the Mexico embassy who was related to Veciana's wife. This might have been related to Oswald's efforts to obtain a visa to visit Cuba. He believed this would be a more illogical explanation than simply a chance encounter between Phillips, Veciana, and Oswald in Dallas. I would also add, as John knows, that Escalante firmly believed that the real Harvey Oswald had visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico City and did not believe there had been an Oswald imposter at the embassy. He believed the imposter scenario was too complex and not realistic for an intelligence operation of this kind. But I know that you've discussed, John Newman has discussed this with Escalante, and I'm sure you've covered this in your writings. He also believed that the preponderance of the evidence, including the eyewitness testimony of Cubans working at the embassy, showed that the man there was in fact Oswald and not an imposter. I want to briefly discuss the two individuals who Escalante named as his top subjects and who we believe were in Dallas on November 22nd. These are Eladio del Valle and Herminio Diaz Garcia. In her book, Claudia Furiati asked Escalante, are there tracks left by some Cubans who might have been a marksman in Dallas? He responded, Eladio Yito del Valle was brutally murdered on the same day that David Ferry died in mysterious circumstances on the eve of testifying about his participation in the Dallas assassination. Yito del Valle has an extensive history in our files. A former parliamentarian in the Batista era, he was also an agent of military intelligence service during the dictatorship. He was a partner of Santos Traficante in smuggling operations during the pre-revolutionary years. And he fled the United States on January 1, 1959, when Castro took over. Immediately after he arrived in exile, he joined the conspiracies of Carlos Prio and Tony Verona, who were associated with David Ferry, the pilot they used for their subversive expeditions against Cuba. The investigations of Yito take us to Santos Traficante, where we encounter one of his henchmen and buddies, an old Cuban gangster, Herminio Diaz Garcia, who Tony Summers mentioned yesterday. This character was involved in an anti-government conspiracy in Havana up until going into exile in 1962. The criminal record of Herminio Diaz is extensive. A paid assassin for the dictator Trujillo, in 1948 he murdered in Mexico a Cuban named Rogelio Hernandez, from whom he took the victim's surname as a pseudonym. In 1957, again under the orders of Trujillo, he attempted to murder the president of Costa Rica, Jose Figueres. He was subsequently detained in that country. Both Yito del Valle and Herminio Diaz were expert shooters. If you carefully check the descriptions given by witnesses of the Dallas crime, gathered together by Garrison as well as the Warren Commission, you're going to find that 4 people mentioned having seen in the book depository, quote, 2 Latinos or Cubans, one of them black with an unmistakable bald patch on their heads. These descriptions correspond to Herminio, who was mulatto, and Yito del Valle, who was white, but with a dark complexion. Both had unmistakable bald patches. All this permits us to conclude that Cuban agents of the CIA, Herminio Diaz and Eladio del Valle, participated in the assassination of Kennedy. In his 2000 book, Escalante added that additional information had been provided him by Antonio Tony Cuesta, a Cuban exile leader who had been imprisoned in Cuba and was about to be released in 1978. Escalante wrote, shortly after his release, years later, Antonio Cuesta affirmed that Herminio Diaz and Eladio del Valle were part of the Kennedy assassination operation. According to Cuesta, they arrived in Dallas on November 20, 1963, and subsequently handled large sums of money. He affirmed that he learned this from Herminio Diaz, who had referred to it on one occasion. And his book also has a lot of additional detail about this. And then you heard already from Tony Summers about an additional witness that he interviewed, confirming this story. So I won't repeat that. I'd also like to speak briefly about my conversations with E. Howard Hunt. I met Howard Hunt in 1995 when we were filming the movie NIXON in Los Angeles. We brought Hunt out from Miami to serve as a consultant on the film. I spent substantial time talking with Hunt, who was, of course, a key figure in Watergate. Hunt had been a CIA officer since the early 1950s, and even before that with his precursor, the OSS. He had been involved in many of the agency's black ops, including the 1954 coup in Guatemala and the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961. I believe that Hunt may have been involved in the plot against JFK, or at least would have a substantial knowledge of who was involved. At that time in 1995, he was not prepared to open up and talk about this subject. However, a decade later, I received a call from Hunt's son saying that he was now prepared to talk and even to collaborate on a book. And I should mention that, as you may know, Nixon on the Watergate tapes appeared to be very afraid of Hunt. He said, "This fellow Hunt, he knows too much. This is going to blow open the whole Bay of Pigs thing, and this is going to be very dangerous for the CIA." And then his chief of staff, Haldeman, later said that the Bay of Pigs thing was a code word for the Kennedy assassination. So I flew to Miami. I spent about a week interviewing Hunt on film with his son, St. John Hunt. Ultimately, I felt that Hunt, who was in his 80s and in a wheelchair, was very conflicted and could not fully open up and tell what he knew. I believe that part of him wanted to do so with the encouragement of his son, St. John. This is all covered in St. John's book. But he was under tremendous pressure from other members of his family and also his lawyer not to do so. I decided that I could not work with him on a book under these circumstances and withdrew from the project. He later completed the book with another writer, which was published shortly after his death under the title American Spy. However, Hunt did make many interesting comments, both in writing and verbally, which he would not repeat on camera. He wrote out a handwritten memo for St. John along with some other notes and diagrams, giving his version of the assassination story. I just want to quote what Hunt wrote in his memo, which is reproduced in St. John's book. And he used some code names, but then he later provided a key to what those were. So I'll just read you the clear version. So he wrote, 1962, LBJ recruits Cord Meyer. 1963, Cord Meyer discusses plot with David Phillips, and he brings in William Harvey and Antonio Veciana. He meets with Oswald in Mexico City that year. Veciana meets with Frank Sturgis in Miami and enlists David Morales in anticipation of killing JFK there, but LBJ changes itinerary to Dallas, citing personal reasons. In Miami, Sturgis tells Hunt that he's buying guns for some friends who could be mafia or Cuban activists. Sturgis brings Morales to a meeting he has with Hunt, where the big event is referred to. After Morales leaves Sturgis, he says, "Are you with us?" Hunt replies that he can't make a decision without knowing what the big event is. When Sturgis says killing Kennedy, Hunt is incredulous, doesn't have a lot of faith in Sturgis, and says, "You've got everything you need, why do you need me?" Sturgis replies that Hunt could help covering up. Hunt says he won't get involved in anything involving Bill Harvey, who's an alcoholic psycho. That's probably true. That ends Hunt's part. He resumes normal life and does not see Sturgis until Bernard Barker brings him into the Watergate break-in. Like the rest of the country, Hunt is stunned by JFK's death. This is all part of his memo. And realizes how lucky he is not to have had a direct role. In Danbury Federal Prison after Watergate, Sturgis and Hunt reflect on the big event. Oswald is dead, so the feds have nobody to prosecute. Sturgis speculates that Jack Ruby was selected to kill Oswald by the mob. Sturgis reveals that one of the Dallas shooters was a foreigner. That's the end of the memo. So this is a remarkable memo, whatever Hunt's motivations were in writing it. Howard Hunt specialized in the black arts of propaganda and disinformation for the CIA. So he may very well have applied this training in writing this. It should be treated with a great deal of skepticism. It may contain elements of truth as well as speculation, hearsay, and even fabrication. I've analyzed Hunt's statements extensively in an appendix to St. John's book. I don't have time to go into it now, but I'll say that I'm very skeptical of his statements with regard to LBJ and Cord Meyer, as well as Veciana. I will say that since Hunt was a lifetime Cold Warrior and a strong supporter of the anti-Castro movement, it would seem to me that if he had wanted to construct a wholly fictional scenario, he would have written one which implicated Fidel Castro in the assassination rather than his opponents. Ultimately, the statements of Fabian Escalante and E. Howard Hunt should be treated like information from any other source with rigorous skepticism and analysis based on the known facts and corroborating information. I will leave it to you to draw your own conclusions. I'd like to close by quoting words, which you may have heard before, but words that President Kennedy spoke in his famous speech at American University not far from here on June 10th, 1963. He made clear his intention to work for peace in the world and to try to end the Cold War. Kennedy said, quote, "Enmities between nations as between individuals do not last forever. If we cannot now end our differences, at least we can make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. End quote. President Kennedy is now gone, but I hope his vision will continue to inspire all of us. Thank you. So I think we have about 10 minutes. If anybody wants to make a comment, I'd love to hear it or have a question or whatever. Yes?
Did Escalante ever explain why he did not disclose to the HSCA his understanding of the conspiracy?
Well, I believe he did meet with the HSCA, as I understand it.
We did not get any information from him as to a conspiracy.
I don't know. He didn't explain that, but he said that he had conducted an investigation, at the request of the Cuban government, and that he had presented it at that time to them. And as I understand it, I believe members of the committee met with Castro and maybe some other officials.
I was present in that meeting.
Yeah.
And Fabien was there.
Right. Right. So I don't know. I can't.
I asked him point blank, do you know anything about a conspiracy by the anti-Castro Cubans in the assassination? And the answer was no.
Yeah.
And they helped us in many other ways. I mentioned yesterday that we got the book of the people who were going in and out of the embassy, the photos, and we said, if anybody knows, because we know how strong your intelligence network was, you will know. Tell us what you know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that obviously, Cuba is a very secretive country. A lot of this stuff was classified in Cuba at that time, and I think, as he said in his introduction, that he felt it was the responsibility of the U.S. authorities to solve the crime.
Yeah, but one of the things that would be helpful would be information from the Cuban government.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I can't tell you anymore. You can read it in his book. John?
Maybe a point that is valid here. Is it true that after speaking with us, we had two sessions, one in the Bahamas and one in Rio, that when Fabien got back, he was under house arrest or
Yeah, that's true. What happened was, at least this is my understanding, there was an incident which you might recall in 1996 where the Cubans shot down a plane with some people from Brothers to the Rescue, which is an anti-Castro group. And that caused a big deep freeze in U.S.-Cuban relations and led to the passage of the Helms-Burton Act. And I believe Fabian Escalante was considered to be too close to some Americans, and therefore he was placed what they called en casa, meaning under house arrest. This is all in my book. But so he, and I had extensive talks in 2001 and 2002 with Ricardo Alarcón, who was a very high official of the Cuban government, about why Escalante could not get his book published. And he said that politically it wasn't possible. But later, a few years later, it was published. That's all I can tell you.
Lately, when was that even? What year was that? 77?
77? Was
Yeah.
after he got that information?
Yeah, no, he said he got the information from Tony Cuesta in 1978. Now, why he didn't make it public till 1994, I don't know. Except that
That's what I asked.
yeah, well, I don't know.
Good.
Yes.
I just want to comment that at NARA, I once saw a CIA document that referred to Del Valle, and somebody on the original had helpfully penciled in the number of Del Valle's 201 files in the margin.
Interesting.
So I FOIA'd it,
Uh-huh.
and they immediately replied, we don't release that kind of file. I also noticed the document that the much maligned Dan Rather had also asked for Del Valle's file in 1975.
Interesting. 75, wow.
Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, Del Valle's CIA file is one of those that is still being withheld by the CIA. And I know Jeff Morley has put it on maybe his top 10 list of files that he would like to see released, and I would certainly like to see that too. So, okay, any other comments, questions? All right, well, thank you very much.